Chapter 29 Crash Landing America First. At the start of the 1940s, isolationists came in all stripes: farmers, union leaders, wealthy industrialists, college students, factory workers, and newly arrived immigrants. There were Democrats and Republicans, socialists, communists, radicals, pacifists, FDR lovers, and FDR haters. Most isolationists were patriotic, well-meaning, and sincere citizens, and many were members of a movement called America First. America First was started by a handful of Yale College students in 1940, among them a future president, Gerald Ford, a future Supreme Court Justice, Potter Stewart, and the future first head of the Peace Corps, Sergeant Shriver. Within months of its creation in 1940, it quickly grew into the nation's most influential isolationist organization. It endorsed three principles: an impregnable defense for America, preservation of democracy at home by staying out of war, and no aid for Britain beyond cash and carry. Seeking to brand itself as a mainstream organization, it denied membership to communists and pro-Nazis. But America First had one big problem: its major goal to keep the United States out of the war was the same as Hitler's. And so, as the organization grew in size and influence, right-wing extremists flocked to join. They should have been denied membership, but in overworked, volunteer-staffed local chapters, there were 400 across the nation by 1941. They slipped in through the cracks. Soon, remarked one staffer, America First members became a hodgepodge of sincere citizens dominated by a core of bigots, anti-Semites, particularly bedeviled the organization. Some chapter leaders spewed anti-Semitic accusations, while others invited anti-Semitic speakers to address their members. The chairman of the Indiana chapter wrote that Jews or their appointees are now in possession of our government. And a Kansas chapter leader pronounced FDR and his wife Eleanor Jewish, and Britain's new Prime Minister Winston Churchill a half-Jew. Making matters worse, many local chapters of America First welcomed the support of Father Charles Coughlin, a Catholic priest with a large following on the radio and through his national weekly tabloid Social Justice, who denounced the anti-Christian conspiracy of Jews, communists, FDR, and the British, constantly attacking the president. He spoke admiringly of Hitler and praised Nazi persecution of Jews. When we get through with the Jews in America, he declared, they'll think the treatment they received in Germany was nothing. Seeing America First as an anti-Semitic organization, he urged his supporters to join. They did. In March 1941, President Roosevelt signed Lend-Lease into law, and all doubt that England and America were allies vanished. A national course had been set to see the British through to victory. Because of this, many moderates changed their minds about isolationists and dropped their membership in America First. But the anti-Semites and other extremists remained. They became the core of the organization. That was when Charles Lindbergh decided to join. Roosevelt versus Lindbergh. On April 23, 1941, the day the Greek government fled Athens for Crete, just ahead of the unstoppable German army, Charles spoke at an America First rally at Madison Square Garden in New York. Once again, he denounced America's aid to Britain. The United States, he cried, cannot win this war for England, regardless of how much assistance we extend. Germany, he assured the audience, was sure to win, and the Reich's victory should be greeted with America's cooperation, friendship, and trade. In Charles' tone, many heard a new bitterness and contentiousness that hadn't been there before. His strident attitude whipped the crowd into a fury. They shouted, stomped, shook their fists in the air so violently it made Anne curl inside with shock. Even so, her husband awed her. When he spoke, she felt his great strength and power, and I watched that crowd looking at him with faith, with undivided attention, with trust. He was not using his strength or power intentionally. No, it was simply there in him. 2 days later, at a White House press conference, President Roosevelt told reporters that it was just dumb to think a Nazi victory was inevitable. Lindbergh, he said, sounded like those quitters at Valley Forge who'd urged George Washington to surrender, arguing the British couldn't be defeated. A reporter raised his hand. Why hadn't Colonel Lindbergh, like so many other reserve officers, been called into active military service? The question was a plant. The White House press secretary had tipped off correspondents that if they asked this question, they would get an interesting answer. Earlier, FDR's secretary had done a little research for him on Civil War Copperheads, Northerners with pro-Southern sympathies who'd criticized President Lincoln. Now FDR spun a history lesson for the reporters, ending with the Union Army's refusal to call Copperheads into military service. "Are you talking about Colonel Lindbergh?" asked another reporter. "Yes," said Roosevelt. His message was clear. Charles Lindbergh was a Nazi sympathizer for whom the American Army Air Corps had no use. "My dear Mr. President," a furious Charles wrote on April 27th, "since you, in your capacity as President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief of the Army, have clearly implied that I am no longer of use to this country as a reserve officer, I can see no honorable alternative to tendering my resignation as Colonel in the United States Army Air Corps Reserve." The President gleefully accepted it. Then he sent out his attack dog, Harold to stir up the press. "Wasn't it curious," the Secretary of the Interior pointed out to reporters, "that Lindbergh had no hesitation about sending back to the President his commission in the United States Army Air Corps Reserve, but he still hangs onto the Nazi medal." There was much Betty Morrow disliked about her son-in-law, but his refusal to show any sympathy for victims of the Nazi regime particularly rankled her. An ardent supporter of aid to England, she was active in several private organizations providing help to Europeans. Couldn't her son-in-law muster up even a little revulsion for the Germans' methods? She asked Anne one day. "Impossible," Anne replied. Charles had to remain an impartial observer, a kind of umpire in the war. Betty stared at her daughter a moment, then snapped. I always understood that umpires have whistles and sometimes blow for a foul. But Anne remained adamant. Later, she would even refuse to help her mother put together bundles of clothes for refugees. It would be a violation of her personal neutrality, she said. An indignant Betty would stomp away. And still Charles kept speaking at America First rallies, Chicago, Oklahoma City, Minneapolis, Los Angeles. His words grew angrier, and his crowds grew more raucous. They booed any mention of FDR or Winston Churchill and cheered any reference to British defeat. During one rally, Charles underscored the need for English surrender by describing the country's bombed out cities and starving children. At that, the cavernous hall erupted into cheers and applause. At another rally, when he mentioned the president, the audience chanted, "Hang Roosevelt! Hang Roosevelt!" Lindbergh is Hitler's puppet agent in America, reported the New York Times on August 31st, 1941. And America First was merely a cloak for the greatest Nazi propaganda movement that has ever flourished, as well as Anne's books off their shelves. The streets named after him were renamed. Monuments and plaques were removed. 9-year-old John came home from school, chin quivering, wondering why his parents were traitors. 4-year-old Land began chanting Nazi lover after a car drove by, the passengers screaming it. So many people called the Long Island house, spewing anger and hatred that the family felt compelled to move yet again, this time to isolated Martha's Vineyard, which prompted an avalanche of letters to the FBI. "It is a perfect base for German invasion," warned one. "What is being done to guard this island?" demanded another. "Who is watching this man who so loves the Germans and the New Order?" Still, Charles kept speaking, louder, angrier, like a man with nothing to lose. He met with so much hostility that police motorcycles escorted his car, and detectives went over his hotel rooms with a fine-tooth comb, he told Anne. They even x-rayed the furniture and assigned a detective to every door at the meeting hall and had guards in the rooms beneath the speaker's stand. And then on September 11th, he went to Des Moines. Fall from grace. At the sight of Charles' car, a roar rose from the crowd gathered at the back door of the Des Moines Coliseum. A wild and frightening roar as the driver steered to the curb. Throngs surrounded the vehicle. The police struggled to hold them back, clearing a path. A moment later, the door opened. Hundreds of flashbulbs popped so blindingly that for a moment Charles had to shield his eyes. Lindbergh for president, shouted some people. Nazi lover, shouted others. Charles responded to neither, moving through the crowd with self-assured purpose. He'd expected this rally to be difficult considering Iowa's large pockets of pro-British sentiment. Just that morning, the editor of the Des Moines Register had labeled him Public Enemy #1. In fact, the city was shaping up to be the least friendly place he'd spoken. Inside the hall, the crowd, numbered at only 7,500, was even more restless, and the air felt charged with anger. Everyone seemed to be shouting at once. Lindy for president, Nazi, hang Roosevelt, go back to Germany. Standing tall and full of purpose, Charles approached the podium. He adjusted the microphone, peered out into the crowd. The mob clapped, stomped, booed, heckled, but Charles stood unflinching, supported by the stone foundation of his convictions. Unshakable, implacable, and absolutely sure he was right. Just that day, FDR had issued his shoot-on-sight policy authorizing the U.S. Navy to fire at any hostile vessel. Now Charles prepared to fire his fiercest salvo back at the war agitators. In previous speeches, Charles had hinted at the powerful forces trying to propel America into war. It was time, he told the audience, for the naked facts, for in order to counteract their efforts, we must know exactly who they are. He singled out three groups: the Roosevelt administration, the British, and American Jews. And while most of his criticism was directed at the first two, it was when he returned to the third group that he revealed his ugliest beliefs. He began by saying he understood why Jews wanted America to get into a war with Germany. Nazi persecution was enough to make bitter enemies of any race, but if this country went to war, American Jews would be the first to feel the consequences because there was certain to be a violent outbreak of anti-Semitism. He didn't clarify these comments further, but to many listeners, his implication was clear. If Jews didn't stop lobbying for intervention, they would pay. The Jewish races, for reasons which are not American, wish to involve us in this war, he went on. We cannot blame them for looking out for what they believe to be their own interests, but we must also look out for ours. We cannot allow the natural passions and prejudices of other peoples to lead our country to destruction. Other peoples, Charles was saying that Jewish people living in this country were not Americans but others, a group living within the United States with no allegiance to the nation. Charles Lindbergh, the greatest hero of the day, a man whose utterances carried tremendous weight, had told those in the hall and millions of others listening on the radio that American Jews were dangerous to the country. He'd called them conspirators. A hostile foreign race, and a people deserving of public condemnation. He'd put them on notice that America's tolerance was tenuous, that if they supported intervention, they would be punished. He didn't see his remarks as a signal to hate mongers, nor did it occur to him that there were people in particular President Roosevelt, who supported England not out of narrow interests, but because they believed freedom for Western Europe was essential to American freedom. He simply wanted to get a few things off his chest before some incident resulted in war, and I decided if I waited any longer I might not have another opportunity. And the next day, on September 12, 1941, state representatives in Texas passed a resolution informing the aviator he was no longer welcome in the Lone Star State. In Washington, D.C., a congressman from Alabama waved a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf in front of his colleagues and declared, "It sounds like Charles A. Lindbergh," before heaving the book to the floor in disgust. The San Francisco Chronicle editorialized, "The voice is the voice of Lindbergh, but the words are the words of Hitler." Practically every newspaper in the nation echoed these sentiments, even the ones that supported isolationism, like the Chicago Tribune. It called Lindbergh's address intemperate, intolerant, and repugnant. Liberty magazine, a publication advocating religious freedom, labeled Charles the most dangerous man in America. Before he came along, anti-Semites were shoddy little crooks and fanatics, but now all that has changed. He, the famous one, has stood up in public and given brazen tongue to what obscure malcontents have only whispered. And Wendell Willkie, the 1940 Republican candidate for president, called the speech the most un-American talk in my time by any person of national reputation. Only the White House remained silent. With all the public outrage, there was no need to say a word. The outrage perplexed Charles. "I felt I had worded my Des Moines speech carefully and moderately," he wrote in his journal. Then he added, "It seems that almost anything can be discussed today in America except the Jewish problem." America First straggled on for a few more months. Charles, refusing to apologize or take back any part of his address, continued to speak despite the resignation of several key committee members and thousands of cancelled memberships. On October 3rd, he warned an audience in Fort Wayne, Indiana, that FDR was scheming to cancel the 1942 midterm elections. This, of course, was a baseless accusation. And on October 30th, at Madison Square Garden, he claimed the British had one last desperate plan remaining to win the war: American troops. As he spoke, a peaceful protest took place outside. Then, with no more speeches scheduled until December, Charles went home to Martha's Vineyard. He walked the beach with arthritic Thor hobbling beside him, and shot at targets with John's .22 rifle. He built a treehouse with the boys, complete with drawbridge and spyglass. As he hammered nails, he couldn't help but notice the many ships passing by the island. All are now in dark war paint.